All right, welcome back, Social 30-1. Today, it's time for more textbook. And now we are on to Chapter 11. And Chapter 11 is a continuation of the political unit. The political unit really began in Chapter 5 when we studied authoritarianism by looking at the case studies of Stalin's USSR and Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. Then we jumped into Chapter 10, and in Chapter 10 there is some repeating of authoritarianism, but we also introduced ourselves to political individualism. We introduced ourselves to democracy. We learned about the Canadian and US models. Well, in Chapter 11 we're going to continue with those two case studies, but now we're going to add some of the nuances in that struggle, in that theme of freedom versus control. We're going to be able to look at the Constitution in Canada, the Constitution in the United States, and look at, under what circumstances is it reasonable to limit the rights that are provided by law. So, I already have a lecture based upon this chapter, this lesson. I'm not going to repeat what I talk about there. I just want to talk about what's in the book here. And the book begins with the case of Maher Arar. So Maher Arar is a Syrian-born Canadian citizen who was returning home from a vacation, returning back to Canada, returning back to Montreal, and flying through New York, where he's detained. He's detained because, unknown to him, the name Maher Arar is on a no-fly list, and therefore he is suspected to have ties with terrorism. And this is 2002, so this is 1 year after 9/11. It's even September 2002, so it is 1 year after 9/11, and America and Canada are still at a heightened state of alert, and therefore the Americans, consulting the Canadians, they conclude that this man is a terrorist or has terrorist ties, and they send him to Syria. He is born in Syria, but the reason why he's a Syrian Canadian is he escaped political persecution in Syria. So when he's sent back to Syria, he is sent back to be tortured. This is called rendition. Rendition, Rendition. Rendition is a policy when a liberal country like America may send a person like Maher Arar to a country where they know that the individual will be tortured. And then America can say, well, our hands are clean, we didn't do the torturing, but they can still ensure that the person is tortured. So Maher Arar will be there for roughly a year, mostly without contact with his family, and in a cell. There's going to be all those psychological torturous techniques practiced upon him. In the end, he will be released, but it will be about a year later. And when he's released, he comes back to Canada, and what he really wants is an apology, right? He wants an apology from the Canadian government and from the Americans, because it turns out he wasn't a terrorist. He had no ties with terrorism, that the case against him was very loose, and that the government of Canada didn't do their due diligence in protecting this Canadian citizen. So instead of protecting this citizen, they sent him away. And they sent him away to be tortured, and he nearly died. So the chapter then jumps into a look at the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is a part of the Canadian Constitution. And it looks at different court cases, some landmark court cases in our history that try to establish the precedent. So we have a freedom, like the freedom of speech, but when can the freedom of speech be limited? So we have cases that have, a Canadian and well, obviously Canadian, sorry, and Albertan connection, right? So in Edmonton in the 1990s at King's College, there's a very popular, very effective laboratory coordinator called Delwyn. And I remember Delwyn because I had friends at King's at the time that he was there. And again, he was very effective at his job. He was very popular with the students, and with staff, but it turned out that in the 1990s, his sexual orientation was outed. That people found out that he was gay, and as a gay male at a Christian college, a Christian university, there was a movement to have him dismissed. So he was fired, right? So he's dismissed from his job because of his sexual orientation, and he attempts to file a complaint with the Alberta Human Rights Commission, but he's advised that the relevant provincial human rights legislation does not include sexual orientation as one of the grounds under which you could be guilty of discrimination against you. So 1998 does seem like a long time ago, now that we're in the 2020s. But in 1998, there was no legislation in Canada that was protecting people from discrimination based upon their sexual orientation. And this case of Dalwin versus Alberta is one of those landmark cases that in the spirit of an ideology of liberalism, we do see an evolution of the relationship between government and governed. The definition as to what is discrimination will change based upon this landmark case. And there's other landmark cases about abortion, and with Dr. Morgentaler of 1988. Under what circumstances can a doctor provide an abortion to women? We had a doctor that was providing abortions and was being arrested for it. And once freed from being arrested, he would do more to provide abortions. So we had an opportunity, a need in Canada to, clarify the role of government here and clarify the law in terms of under what circumstances was abortion in fact legal. In Quebec, they had a French language law passed in the 1980s, and as a result, there will be some people that will challenge it. So the French language law says that public signs, posters, and commercial advertising shall be in French only. But there are some very English businesses in places of Quebec, including Montreal, and they challenge the legality of that. And so therefore, the textbook has a number of these cases, and it fits under this realm of, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms gives us these rights, but it says there in the preamble that they can be reasonably limited. What is reasonable? What is not? And ultimately, any province can use what is called the notwithstanding clause to say, notwithstanding the charter, we're going to do our own thing anyway. So definitely by the end of this chapter, we want you to, go back to Social 9 and rediscover the content of the charter. Rediscover the idea of the charter, the protection of rights, it being the ultimate law of the land. All other laws must fall beneath it, but also to understand the nuances, the content of it. So connected to the Canadian Charter is the Quebec Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms that is mentioned in the textbook. And we see the Quebec Charter and the Quebec Social Charter again in my lesson as we talk about, again, the evolutionary nature of these laws. That society has changed since the 1970s when the Quebec Charter was created, or the 1980s when the Canadian Charter was created. So some things that maybe weren't included in the Charter have been included based upon legal precedent since. So for example, the textbook talks about same-sex marriage. And so there was a Liberal MP named of Tom Wappel, W-A-P-P-E-L, who fought against same-sex marriage for over 10 years before it became a reality. And, same-sex marriage is now legal in all jurisdictions in Canada, but there was a time when it wasn't legal, when it was illegal. And now that it's legal because of an evolution of society, liberalism. Things change. And one thing that has changed in Canada is the definition of marriage. So we have royal assent given on July 20th of 2005 to a change in the Civil Marriage Act that will now codify the definition of marriage to not just a man and woman, not just an exclusive heterosexual institution, but now it is worded in a way that is open to same-sex marriages. So that's an example of the evolutionary social nature of Canada. Our social values are changing. The textbook also talks about the collective rights that are listed under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So collective rights speak to some of the cornerstones of Canada, that Canada was built as a nation of nations. It was built as a nation that combined Upper and Lower Canada. So it's an Anglophone nation, it's a Francophone nation, but it is also a nation of First Nations. So not only are we bilingual, we are pluralistic, we are multicultural. And the Canadian Charter recognizes our linguistic rights and our collective rights. A collective right is a right that you have because you belong to a certain group. Now, the textbook talks about the controversy around collective rights. There's many people in the 1990s that talked about this idea of reverse discrimination. And the reverse discrimination would be this idea of trying to promote the future of one collective, maybe at the expense of another. So in the 1990s, within the Canadian military, they looked in and they said, you know what, we have a lot of Anglophone white guys. We don't need to really recruit too many more Anglophone white guys. So when Russ McBride goes and tries to become a part of the Canadian military in the 1990s, or when I looked at the RCMP in the 1990s, they weren't actively searching for people like me. They wanted other people so that they could balance their demographics within their forces. And some people would say that's reverse discrimination. Why not choose people based on merit? You know, why not just choose the best candidate, not the best candidate that fits some kind of profile that will make you more multicultural or multilinguistic? If somebody is more qualified, then they should be seen as a better candidate. So that's the idea of reverse discrimination, and it was very topical in the 90s as there was a backlash by a lot of Anglophones and other people that felt that they were being disadvantaged. Now, fast forward to 20 years, and you know, today we have the term white privilege that would connect with that, right? That white people are born in a society that promotes them, and even if white people themselves may not actively practice racism, the idea is that the system is racist against non-whites. So we have evolved way past the conversation of the book, right? That the book was created in 2008, and the term white privilege wasn't even topical then. So when they update the curriculum, they're going to have to look at social justice and see how the concept of social justice has evolved, keeping in mind Canada is seen as the most social just place on earth, which is head-shaking because we have a lot of problems here still for sure. So we do recognize our collective rights. We recognize Aboriginal and treaty rights in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They are there. We recognize Métis rights, but Métis in general are still fighting to have the same Aboriginal rights to hunting and harvesting that their First Nations brothers would have included in the Charter. So from a perspective of an Anglophone, an Irishman, there's a section in the textbook about an Irish pub in Montreal that had signs up in English, which, I mean, if you're Irish, they're in English. You've already compromised that. You've already lost your language of your own culture. But you go into an English pub or an Irish pub in Montreal, and to get that atmosphere, right? You'd expect to see certain signs and certain promotions promoting that flavor, that brand. It's an Irish pub or it's an English pub. But in Montreal, owners of Irish pubs, including McKibben's Irish Pub, that had vintage advertisements for Guinness and Harp and other types of beer. So they had these vintage signs to kind of set the mood of the place. They were told to take those signs down. They were told that their waitresses and waiters would have to come and speak to the patrons in French first, even though the majority of their patrons were Anglophones. So people were upset with Bill 101, this French language law that made it mandatory for all of these signs to be in French. And the Quebec provincial government said, you know what, we're going to use the notwithstanding clause. We are going to use the notwithstanding clause to say, notwithstanding the Constitution, this is the way it is. We understand that you could see it being in violation of your constitutional rights, but we are going to, notwithstanding the Constitution, continue with the Canadian Charter. All right, so from there, the textbook looks at more with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit rights. It talks about the different treaties, and it's always great to look at a map of Western Canada, and look at the different Indigenous tribes and see what treaty land that you live on. And we here in Wetaskiwin, we're on Treaty 6 land, and it's important to understand as treaty people what that means and what kind of heritage we have. Textbook then goes into the concept of illiberalism. What is illiberalism? And it attaches that story to being French during the War Measures Act. It attaches that story to the Canada's Anti-Terrorist Act. It attaches that story to the Japanese internment. It attaches that idea, illiberalism, to Emergencies Act following 9/11 and the USA Patriot Act and the no-fly list. And it goes back to Maher Arar. That's a whole other chapter, isn't it? And my lexicons on it do an excellent job of summarizing it. But really, the second half of this chapter talks about the concept of illiberalism. What is illiberalism? It's when you have a free and democratic society that is meant to be liberal, meant to uphold and champion human rights, that instead of upholding them, begin to act as an authoritarian state might. And we'll learn more about that in the second half. Yeah, the second half of our introduction to Chapter 11.